Jo Rogers was born on November 12, 1952, to Wilhelm and Virginia Etzler. Later, she married Hal Rogers, and they settled on a farm in Wilshire, Ohio, leading a blissful life. Their first daughter, Michelle, was born on February 22, 1972, and their second daughter, Christy, was born on October 6, 1974. Hal and Jo Rogers diligently cared for their animals. Their daughters, Michelle and Christy, cherished the animals on the farm and found happiness in their fulfilling life despite the farm's demanding work. Michelle, despite facing some challenges, always watched over Christy. They both attended school, and Michelle had a boyfriend named Jeff Feasby. However, Michelle had endured a traumatic experience involving her Uncle John, Hal's brother, who had once blindfolded and assaulted her. Hal and Jo were unaware of this until John was arrested by the police for assaulting another woman in the same town. Because of the disturbing experiences she had endured, Michelle was highly protective of her younger sister. Christy was a bubbling and outgoing girl. She was a cheerleader, loved softball, and was very close to her father. She looked up to Michelle even though they had their arguments as sisters do. Michelle was sometimes jealous of the attention Christy got from their father, but despite her struggles, Michelle always cared for her little sister. The family faced many challenges on the farm, but Jo was the strongest. She worked long hours at 2 jobs and took care of the family and the animals. She was often exhausted, but she never stopped working. On Friday, May 26, 1989, 36-year-old Jo Rogers and her 2 daughters, 17-year-old Michelle and 15-year-old Christy, went on a long-awaited road trip to Florida. They left their farm in Ohio and were looking forward to enjoying a family vacation. Jo, who worked the night shift at a distribution center, was excited to give her girls their first vacation. They left Jo's husband, Hal, to take care of the farm and drove their Oldsmobile Calais south on Interstate 75. Their plans included visiting theme parks and enjoying the Florida sun. They visited the Jacksonville Zoo, Silver Springs, SeaWorld, Epcot, and Disney's MGM Studios, having a great time away from farm responsibilities. On June 1st, they reached the motel in Tampa and were thinking about going to Busch Gardens. Michelle called her boyfriend, Jeff, to have a conversation with him. At 12:57 p.m., the family made another call to Busch Gardens. At night, the Rogers women were seen happily dining at the motel's restaurant by a businessman. But after that evening, they mysteriously disappeared. The last photo they took in their motel was Michelle getting ready for their next adventure. Sadly, they never got to see the sunrise again. Hal Rogers anxiously waited for Jo and his daughters to return from their Florida vacation. Even though he hadn't heard from them for days, he tried to stay positive, hoping they were all right. As time passed, his worries grew and wondered where they could be. On June 4th, 1989, the Amber Waves, a sailboat returning to Tampa from Key West, spotted something troubling in the water. They saw what looked like a body of a woman loading face down. Her hands were tied behind her back, her feet bound, and a thin yellow rope was around her neck. She was unclothed from the waist down. Someone on the Amber Waves radioed the Coast Guard, and a rescue boat was sent from the Bay Borough Harbor Station in St. Petersburg. The Coast Guard crew located the body and had difficulty retrieving it. There was something heavy attached to the rope around her neck, making it hard to bring her up. They noted the location and cut the line around her neck, placing her in a body bag before heading back to the station. However, before reaching the shore, they received another distressing message. Another female body had been spotted by 2 people on a sailboat. This time it was 2 miles off the pier in St. Petersburg. Like the first body, this one was also face down, bound with a rope around the neck and naked from the waist down. The same Coast Guard crew went to recover it. As they were dealing with the second body, another call came in, a third female floating on a short distance away to the east. Once the third body was also recovered, all 3 bodies were brought to the Coast Guard station for examination and to be photographed by the arriving investigators from the Florida Marine Patrol. They were in a state of decomposition, making identification challenging. The women's hands and feet were tied in a similar manner, and the second woman had managed to free one hand before dying. Duct tape covered their mouths, and the second and third bodies had concrete blocks tied to the ropes around their necks. It was believed that the first body also had a concrete block tied to its rope. Detectives suspected that the woman may have been assaulted and then thrown alive into the water with concrete blocks tied to their necks, causing them to drown. The discovery of the 3 murdered women shocked the community, leading to a massive investigation. Divers searched the waters for evidence, and police boats looked for more bodies in the bay. Autopsies were conducted to find out how they died and gather more clues. Since the bodies had no IDs, detectives tried to identify them through their clothing and jewelry. One of the women, the oldest, had long brown hair and was found in a black t-shirt with a gold wedding band on her left hand. Another had medium-length brown hair, wore a peach-colored shirt, and had 3 cloth bracelets with pink, green, and white stripes on her left wrist. The third woman, the youngest, had wavy brown hair and was dressed in a black tank top over a blue bikini top. She had 4 rings on her left hand, 2 gold and 2 silver, 1 on each finger. The struggle she put up allowed her to free one hand from the rope around her wrist. While Joe Rogers' husband, Hal, waited anxiously at the farm, he grew more worried as the days passed without any news from Joe and the girls. He called Joe's friends and relatives to check if they had heard from her, confirmed with her boss at the distribution center about a return date, and reported them missing to the authorities, but nobody had any information. Then early one night that week, Jeff Feesby, Michelle's boyfriend, called Hal. He had received a postcard for Michelle with a picture of a girl in a bikini and a bull gator and the words "Fun Times in Florida" on the front. Hal asked Jeff to bring it to the house. As he read the postcard repeatedly, he couldn't find any clues about what might have happened. Feeling desperate and determined to do something, he went to his bank on Wednesday and withdrew some money. He had a plan in mind. Hal decided to conduct his own search from the air. He would find a private plane and a pilot, and together they would fly over the roads that Joe and the girls had taken from Ohio to Florida. On Thursday, June 8th, the maid at the Days Inn, Tampa, noticed something strange about room 251. The guest had checked in a week ago, but the room seemed untouched since then. The beds were neat, the bathroom was unused, and personal items were left behind. The maid became suspicious and shared her concerns with the hotel's general manager. They decided to call the Tampa police to report the guest might be missing, especially given the recent news about the 3 bodies found in the bay. The Tampa police arrived and realized that the room could hold crucial information about the women's identities. They sealed off the room and called for support from detectives in both Tampa and St. Petersburg. The investigators carefully searched the room, taking photographs, collecting fingerprints, and examining all personal belongings. A technician matched the prints found in the room, including those on a tube of an Oral-B Sesame Street toothpaste with the prints taken from the bodies in the bay. It was confirmed that the room belonged to the same 3 women. Meanwhile, the detectives started to make initial identifications using the information found in their purses and the registration from the front desk. Once they identified that the 3 women were Joe, Michelle, and Christy, they now called Hell in Ohio. On that same day, 2 significant events occurred in Tampa Bay. Firstly, the police started looking for the car the woman drove when coming to Florida. They were able to gather information about its make, model, and license plate from the motel registration form. Unfortunately, the car was not found in the Days Inn parking lot, so they expanded their search to the nearby areas and eventually located it at a boat ramp along the Courtney Campbell Parkway, just a few miles away. The car seemed untouched since Joe and the girls had left it there a week ago. It was locked and the passenger seat was pushed forward as if someone had recently gotten out from the back seat. Inside the car, they found a Clearwater Beach brochure, a deck of Uno cards, and a puzzle book that someone had been working on in the back seat. On the front passenger seat, there was a piece of Days Inn stationery with directions written by Joe herself, guiding them from the motel to a boat ramp. The directions said, "Turn right, west on 60, 2.5 miles on right side, alt before, bridge." Besides these words, there was one more obstruction, blue with white. Now one thing seemed likely: the individual responsible for this crime probably owned a blue and white boat. The second major breakthrough, which was quite shocking, occurred when one of the investigators received a call from the chief of detectives at the Van Wert County Sheriff's Office. The detective wanted to ensure that the team investigating the homicides knew all the relevant facts about the Rogers family. He shared information about Michelle and her uncle, John Rogers, who was now in prison for assaulting a woman. He had also previously blindfolded Michelle and assaulted her. Although John was in prison at the time of the murders, the investigators couldn't overlook the striking similarities between what happened to Michelle on the farm and the events in Tampa Bay. In both cases, Michelle seemed to have been bound and assaulted. This raised the possibility that John might have orchestrated the murders from behind bars, possibly arranging for someone with a boat to take them out on the water. To get a clearer picture, they needed to learn more about the Rogers family. Understanding Joe, Michelle, and Christy better could lead them to discover how they ended up on the bay that night, alone with someone who intended to harm them. The very next day after identifying the bodies, 2 detectives flew to Ohio to delve deeper into the Rogers family. The detectives questioned Hal about his brother, John Rogers. Hal clearly stated that John was a loner, and at the time of the missing and eventual death of the Rogers women, he was in jail. There was no way he could plan a murder from inside the cell, as he had no connections with his prison mates. But during their inquiries, the detectives discovered unsettling information about Hal himself. They learned that Hal had posted John's bail when he was accused of assaulting a woman. And despite later learning about the allegations involving Michelle, he kept his word to support John. Hal explained that he wanted to keep peace within the family and believed that someone was lying. He had also said that he had already promised Joe that he would pay for his bail before he knew about the Michelle incident, and so he had kept his word. Another peculiar incident was a $7,000 cash withdrawal Hal made while the girls were missing. He explained that he needed the money to search for his family in Florida as he didn't believe in credit cards. However, before he could carry out his plan, he learned of their deaths. After numerous interviews with Hal, the detectives found no concrete evidence implicating him in the murders. They observed his grief-stricken demeanor and accepted his explanation for the bond and the cash withdrawal. When the detectives asked him where the $7,000 went, Hal took them to the back of his truck. Inside it was a bag that had $6,000 and the rest was in Hal's pocket. After interviews in Ohio, detectives cleared Hal and John Rogers as suspects in the Florida murders. In October 1989, lead detective John Capel discovered a crucial lead while going through a bulletin from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. The bulletin mentioned an assault on a 24-year-old Canadian woman off Madeira Beach that occurred on May 15, 1989, just 2 weeks before the Rogers women were murdered. The description of the attacker's bow matched the one the Rogers women were last seen in. Capel and another detective flew to Canada to interview the victim and became convinced that the same man responsible for the assault was likely involved in the Rogers murder. The Canadian woman had met a man named David Posner at 711 in Madeira Beach. He was older, had tinted windows on his dark-colored four-wheel drive vehicle, and claimed to own an aluminum company and lived in Bradenton. He offered to take her on a boat ride the next afternoon. When she arrived, her friend decided not to go, so she went alone. After a seemingly pleasant trip, the man's demeanor changed and he assaulted her. He threatened her, found her with duct tape and forced her to comply. When they returned to the shore, he even apologized for his actions. The woman was able to escape and provided the detectives with enough information to create a composite sketch of her attacker. Back in Florida, the detectives realized there was no individual named David Posner who matched the attacker's description. They decided to release the composite drawing and description of the man, his boat, and his vehicle to the public. This resulted in 400 tips pouring in, leading to a surge of activity in the investigation. However, despite their efforts, none of the leads seemed to pan out, and the case hit another dead end. As time passed, the number of detectives assigned to the case dwindled. Nearly 6 months after the murders, on December 23, 1989, the case seemed all but forgotten until Sergeant Glenn Moore took charge. Though lacking homicide experience, Moore refused to let the case fade away. He sought to reinvigorate the investigation, hoping to finally identify and apprehend the elusive suspect responsible for the heinous crimes. In October 1990, Joe Insteffi, a Tampa resident, saw a newspaper clipping of a composite drawing related to an assault case in Madeira Beach. She believed the sketch resembled one of her neighbors, a man who had recently moved in the area with his family. Despite feeling uneasy about him, Steffi hesitated to report her suspicions to the police, fearing involvement in the investigation. Later, during the chance encounter with the Hillsborough County Sheriff's deputy in her accounting class, Steffi confided in him about her neighbor's resemblance to the composite drawing. She asked the deputy to pass along the information without revealing her identity, hoping to remain uninvolved. Unfortunately, the tip somehow did not reach Sergeant Glenn Moore and his team who were working on the Rogers murders case. They were overwhelmed with numerous tips and decided to utilize a new software called Holmes to organize their information better. They also sought assistance from the FBI's Behavioral Sciences Unit in Quantico. During this time, they interviewed Hal Rogers again and questioned around 70 people in Ohio to gain insights into the emotional states of Joe Rogers and her daughters. Meanwhile, a local newspaper, the Tribune, published an article pointing suspicions toward Hal Rogers, leading investigators to put Hal through a polygraph test to clear his name. After Hal passed the test, Sergeant Moore held a press conference to affirm that Hal was never a suspect, but a victim in the case. It was 1991, around a year and a half passed since Joe and Steffi had shared her suspicions with the sheriff's deputy, but there had been no action taken yet. The man she found suspicious had already moved away with his family, having hardly interacted with others despite being amiable with people around him. The investigation into the Rogers murders continued with Sergeant Moore sharing information received from Quantico during a press conference. Steffi's tip remained unaddressed as she wondered if the police were conducting background checks on the man she suspected. But again, gradually the case's progress was getting slower and slower. It was the spring of 1992. It had now been 3 years since the investigation started. The investigators had received 1,500 tips in this time, but still were nowhere close to identifying the assailant. However, they made progress in profiling the killer, concluding it was the work of a single man based on the way the hands and legs were tied. They suspected that the person who gave directions to the Rogers family was the same individual who later lured them out. A distinctive handwriting on the directions prompted them to conduct a handwriting test. Sergeant Moore announced the new theory at a press conference, suggesting that the killers were likely charming, likable, and appeared respectable and harmless. Back in March 1992, Joe and Steffi's sister called the police to say that Steffi knew a man who resembled the suspect's sketches. The police tried to reach Steffi, but they couldn't get through. On May 14, 1992, it had almost been 2.5 years since Steffi had tipped the police about her neighbor. Now Steffi saw the news and Sergeant Moore's press conference in the newspaper and wondered if she should report her suspicion again. Steffi recalled her former neighbor who was an aluminum contractor and thought his handwriting might match the one in the composite sketch. She talked to Eileen Prisbis, a civilian investigator, about her neighbor whose name was Oba Chandler in the contract, his boat and his SUV. She found the contract in check from when Chandler built a port for her neighbor, Moselle Smith. Steffi compared the handwriting from the contract and the press conference clipping, and she was convinced it was the same. Steffi called the task force again and told Prisbis about the contract and handwriting. She wanted to provide a lead. They faxed the contract and checked to the investigators, but the task force was dealing with a flood of tips. So it took time to look into Stephanie's information among the other leads. Meanwhile, the investigators used billboards to seek public help in finding the killer. Joanne, Steffi, and Moselle Smith had already shared their suspicions, but there was a backlog of tips. Frustrated, they sent the handwriting samples again, which now caught the attention of the task force. Investigator Prisbis reevaluated the writing, but couldn't make a definite match. The lead was handed to another investigator, J.J. Gigan, to follow up. On Friday, July 31st, Geo Gigan visited Moselle Smith in Tampa to obtain the original contract related to Oba Chandler. Upon comparing the contract's handwriting with the directions on the brochure, the task force found strong similarities, leading them to consider Oba Chandler as a new suspect. They quickly gathered more information about him, discovering he was a 45-year-old man living with his family in Port Orange near Daytona Beach. Oba Chandler became a significant suspect in the investigation of the Rogers women's murders. At the time of the murders, he lived on Dalton Avenue, close to where Joe and the girls vanished, just 2 miles from the boat ramp. Records show that he owned a 21-foot Bayliner boat with a blue and white interior and a dark blue Jeep Cherokee. He had an extensive criminal history, including charges of kidnapping, burglary, armed robbery, and counterfeiting. They compared a picture of Chandler with a composite sketch, and it was a perfect match. After 3 years of relentless investigation, Sergeant Moore was convinced they had their man. Another fact emerged. The man who had assaulted the Canadian woman before also owned an aluminum company, similar to Chandler's line of work as an aluminum contractor. To keep his real name hidden and avoid alerting Chandler, they referred to him as the Tin Man. The task force expanded rapidly, collaborating with the state attorney's office to build a strong case against Chandler. Chandler had a troubled past with a history of crimes and a penchant for frightening and threatening people. Investigators spread across Florida and the Midwest collecting evidence against him. Born on October 11, 1946 in Cincinnati, Ober Jr. had a tumultuous childhood with his father taking his own life when he was young. He got into trouble early on, stealing cars and facing numerous arrests. As an adult, he faced a long list of charges, including possession of counterfeit money and armed robbery. Chandler married Deborah and Whiteman on May 14, 1988, just 10 days after she had divorced her previous husband. They bought a house on Dalton Avenue close to Joe and Steffi, who later reported her suspicions about Chandler. Chandler's house had a canal leading to Tampa Bay, where he had a 21-foot Bayliner boat during the time of the Rogers murders. He sold a boat shortly after the crimes. He also owned a dark blue Jeep Cherokee during the same period, resembling the vehicle described by the Canadian tourist who was assaulted. Investigators had now gathered enough evidence to consider Oba Chandler as the prime suspect in the Rogers women's murders. In the summer of 1990, as news about the Rogers investigation and its upcoming feature on Unsolved Mysteries spread, Chandler, his wife and young daughter Whitney, left their home on Dalton Avenue. They stopped making mortgage payments, leading the bank to foreclose and sell the house. Chandler moved to Florida's East Coast in July 1990, initially living in Broward County before settling in Port Orange near Daytona Beach. Despite his credit issues, by October 1991, he leased a house in his daughter's name. Chandler appeared normal to his neighbors, although they didn't know what he did for a living. Now, in 1992, investigators confirmed his handwriting and fingerprints matched evidence from the case, leading to surveillance of his new home with phone monitoring. In early September 1992, while other tasks were ongoing, 2 investigators, Detective Katie Connor-Dabina and FDLE agent John Halliday, traveled to Toronto to speak with the Canadian tourist who had been assaulted at the Madeira Beach in May 1989, just 2 weeks before the murders. The woman, now 27 and married, worked as a social worker. They showed her 6 pictures of different men and asked her to identify the person involved in the incident. When she saw the 3rd photo, she became visibly upset and confirmed that this was her assaulter. The photograph featured Oba Chandler. She signed the photo and asked to turn it over as it was disturbing her. A large team of about 40 to 50 law enforcement officers from various agencies, including the St. Petersburg Police, FDLE, and the FBI, were now surveilling Chandler around the clock. They had a command post near his house with a video camera monitoring his driveway. Whenever Chandler left, multiple unmarked cars followed him, carefully rotating to avoid being noticed. The FBI provided 2 small planes that took turns tracking Chandler from above, ensuring they never lost sight of him. They communicated with the ground unit using the radio saying Eagle has the eyeball. After setting up surveillance, prosecutors arrived in Volusia County with an arrest warrant for Chandler on the charges of assault. Investigators planned to question him, showing photos of the victim to prompt him to talk to the FBI's Daytona Beach office. It was Thursday, September 17, 1992, the day that police had planned to question Chandler. That morning, just before Chandler was to be arrested, an unexpected event took place. As Chandler left his house in his blue Toyota Corolla, the surveillance teams debated whether to arrest him immediately or continue following him. They decided to keep trailing him, hoping he'd lead them to something significant. Chandler drove for a long time, and when he reached Lake City, the officers faced difficulties due to low fuel in the plane and a thunderstorm. They lost sight of Chandler in the heavy rain and panic set in. They searched frantically but couldn't find him. Frustration and anger spread amongst the investigators, wondering if they missed their chance. They had to wait, monitoring Chandler's home, hoping he would return. Meanwhile, mysterious calls from Cincinnati and northern Kentucky added to the tension. The fear of Chandler potentially harming someone else haunted them. After losing Chandler for a week, the investigators received a call from Georgia indicating he was returning. On September 24, 1992, they planned to arrest him without wasting any more time. Police waited for him on the I-95, but he took a different route. At a gas station in Port Orange, officers surrounded his car and arrested him for assault and battery. Back at the FBI office, they tried to make him talk, but he remained calm and asked for a lawyer. On the drive back to Pinellas County, Chandler talked casually with an FBI agent, even offering to provide information about a car scheme. The agent couldn't believe his audacity. Despite Chandler's complaints, his handcuffs remained secure. The next morning, Chandler had his initial hearing in a small courtroom at the Pinellas County Jail. The judge read the affidavit and kept bail at $1 million. Investigators found Chandler's blue and white Bayliner boat with a yellow Volvo engine. Inside his house in Port Orange, they discovered a mint green mesh shirt. The Canadian woman and her friend identified Chandler in a lineup. One of Chandler's many children, Crystal Mays, revealed that he visited her in 1989, admitting he was on the run for assault and possible killings. Her husband, Rick Mays, said Chandler confessed to assaulting women in his boat and throwing one overboard, mentioning he had murdered 3 women. With this new evidence, Chandler was indicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder in November, but the trial would not take place for another 2 years. It was the spring of 1994, several months before the trial was scheduled to begin. The prosecution now had access to Chandler's phone bills. While studying the bills, they noticed something strange. On May 15, 1989 and June 2, 1989, several collect calls were made to Chandler's house at specific times: 5:49 p.m. and 1:12 a.m., 1:30 a.m., 1:38 a.m., 8:11 a.m., and 9:52 a.m., respectively. All these calls were traced back to a special billing number, 813-223-0000, used for marine phone calls. The prosecution wanted to know who made these calls. They discovered that the calls had to be made through a marine phone operator, but unfortunately, the records were destroyed. After persistent efforts, they found backup copies and were astonished to see that the May 15th call was made from a boat named Gypsy One, with the caller identifying himself as Oba. The June 2nd calls were also from Gypsy One, with the 5th call identifying the person as Obi. On September 19, 1994, Chandler's trial began. During the trial, the prosecution acted swiftly, calling around 20 witnesses each day. They presented evidence like the directions found on the brochure in Joe Rogers' car, the palm print on the brochure, and Chandler's call from his boat. Chandler's daughter, Crystal Mays, testified about his shocking confession in Cincinnati, where he admitted to physical assault and possibly murder. In jail too, witnesses had heard himself incriminate himself, talking about assaulting a foreign woman and mentioning the Rogers case. A laborer, Rollins Cooper, shared how Chandler spoke about a date with 3 women on the day of the disappearance. The Canadian tourist bravely testified about her terrifying encounter with Chandler. How Rogers, Michelle's husband, remained strong in court, thanking the brave Canadian woman. In a crowded courtroom, Chandler testified in his defense, appearing calm and composed. He confirmed meeting the Rogers family when they asked for directions to Days Inn in Tampa. He thought they meant a different one at first, but one of the girls clarified and directed them toward Rocky Point. Chandler explained that he was returning from a job estimate when he encountered them at a gas station near Interstate 4 in East Tampa. During his testimony, Oba Chandler denied any involvement in the murders and refuted allegations made by witnesses. He explained a fishing trip gone wrong on the night of June 1, 1989. After finishing fishing that night, Chandler encountered a problem with his boat. He attempted to start the engine, but it only sputtered briefly before stopping. Investigating further, he noticed a strong smell of gas and found that a fuel hose had burst, causing the entire 40-gallon tank to leak into the space beneath the boat's deck. Scott Hopkins, the investigator, noticed something odd in Chandler's testimony about the fuel leak in his boat. Knowing the boat well, Hopkins was certain Chandler was lying. He immediately informed the lead prosecutor during the lunch break, and a mechanic was set to reinvestigate Chandler's boat. After the lunch break, the prosecutor wasted no time in beginning the cross-examination. Chandler reluctantly admitted to his past felony convictions, and the prosecutor pushed him about the murder accusations made by his daughter and son-in-law, to which Chandler invoked the Fifth Amendment. The prosecutors then questioned the events of June 1, 1989, and exposed contradictions in Chandler's story about the fuel leak and his whereabouts. Evidence revealed that Chandler had made calls from the water before getting help, challenging his claims of being at a different location. The prosecutor also confronted Chandler about his escape to Cincinnati after the composite drawing of the Madeira Beach suspect was released. Chandler tried to downplay his fear, but the prosecutor implied they might have found their suspect. During a crucial moment, the prosecution team informed the lead prosecutor of a breakthrough regarding Chandler's boat. The mechanic had returned after checking the boat. Armed with this information, he cornered Chandler asking about the broken fuel line. When asked about the fuel line's position, Chandler gave the wrong answer. When asked about the anti-siphon valve, Chandler could not give any answer. The prosecutor then told the court that the anti-siphon valve would automatically prevent a gas leak by closing the fuel line. Chandler was caught in his own web of lies, and after a day, it was time for the ruling. As the 12 jurors left the courtroom for deliberations, Chandler wore a faint smile on his face. The jury didn't take long to reach a unanimous verdict, and as they returned and took their seats, his smile vanished, replaced by a look of anticipation. The verdict was passed on to Judge Schaefer and then to the clerk to read it out. Chandler was found guilty of all charges, including first-degree murder. The court remained calm with no outburst or celebrations. The prosecutor showed little emotion, barely smiling. Chandler's fate had been sealed and justice had been served. On September 29, 1994, Chandler was convicted on 3 counts of murder. And on November 4, 1994, Oba Chandler was sentenced to death. After the terrible murders, the family wanted to honor Joe and her daughters, Michelle and Christy. They took a family portrait, but since the girls were gone, they left 3 empty spaces. They put old photos of Joe and the girls in those spaces, creating a special picture. Joe's mom hung the portrait in the living room. It looks a bit strange, but it brings her comfort. Hal Rogers, Joe's husband, often looks at Joe's picture in a red dress. Even though he still feels sad, Hal believes that Joe and the girls watch over him, giving him strength. The portrait shows how much the family loved each other, and it reminds them that Joe and the girls are still with them in spirit. Whenever they see the picture, they feel the love that will never fade away, keeping Joe and her daughters forever in their hearts. On November 15, 2011, 22 years after the murders of the Rogers women, Boba Chandler took his last breath at 4:25 p.m. when he met his end through a lethal injection. When the bodies of the 3 women were discovered, their mouths were taped shut, but their eyes were left open. The killer's intention, according to the FBI profile, was to make them watch and experience fear. Hal Rogers, the father and husband they left behind, now sat across from the killer in the witness room. Separated by glass, he was witnessing Chandler's death. Chandler was strapped to a gurney with tubes in his arms as he faced his execution by lethal injection at the age of 65. When asked if he had anything to say, Chandler replied with a simple no before closing his eyes for the very last time. However, an hour after his death, it was revealed that Chandler had actually left a final statement. Online paper he had written, "You are killing an innocent man today. Discover the chilling world of secret crime mysteries, where we delve into the most perplexing cold cases and unsolved crimes. Join us as we unravel hidden clues and explore haunting mysteries. Subscribe now and be part of the journey to bring these cases to light." In 1982, 15-year-old Karen Stitt had just relocated to the West Coast. Having moved from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, she was now living with her father and brother in Palo Alto, California. A student at Palo Alto High School, One of her classmates noted that she was a cool girl who often wore rock t-shirts and a bright smile, though she tended to be somewhat reserved in class. Karen quickly adapted to her new social environment and became adept at navigating California's public transportation system. She began dating a boy from the nearby town of Sunnyvale and would regularly travel by bus to see him. Karen rode the bus to Sunnyvale on the evening of September 2nd, 1982 to spend time with her boyfriend, David. Karen met David at a bus stop near the intersection of El Camino Real and Wolf Road in Sunnyvale sometime between 8 and 9 p.m. The couple then went into a 711 convenience store by the bus stop to buy something to drink before heading on to Golfland, a nearby miniature golf course. They later walked to the grounds of a local elementary school. Around midnight, David and Karen began walking back to the intersection where they had met up earlier in the evening so that Karen could catch the bus back home. David opted not to walk her all the way back to the bus stop, however, as he was worried he would get in trouble with his parents for getting home later than they had instructed. He felt guilty for not walking Karen all the way back to the bus stop and waiting with her. He last saw Karen as she was just south of the intersection where the bus stop was located just before she reached it. Just before 11 o'clock the following morning, a truck driver was making a delivery to the garden center near the bus stop where Karen would have needed to catch the bus. Amongst the bushes at the base of a retaining wall that ran along the garden center's driveway, he noticed a nude young woman. He notified the staff at the garden center, who in turn called the police, who confirmed that the young woman was deceased. She was later identified as Karen Stitt. Karen's hands had been bound behind her back with her own shirt, and her jacket was found tied around her left ankle. Karen had been stabbed a total of 59 times in her throat, back, abdomen, and chest. 18 of the wounds had pierced her heart and 10 of them had perforated her lungs. Karen had also been raped. Leaves and dirt around her feet had been disturbed, and markings in the dirt indicated that the ground may have been kicked, meaning that Karen may have still been alive when she was left at the location. Karen's killer had left numerous pieces of evidence at the scene, although it would be nearly 20 years before it could be properly analyzed. In 2000, evidence from Karen's case was sent to the Santa Clara County Crime Laboratory. Technicians there were able to develop a male DNA profile from both a bloodstain left on the top of the cinder block retaining wall just above Karen's body when it was discovered and from a cutting that had been taken from Karen's jacket, which had been tied to her ankle. The DNA profile from each of the samples was from the same individual. The crime lab was also able to identify a partial male YSTR DNA profile from sperm cells found on slides from vaginal swabs taken during Karen's autopsy. While this was not a complete profile, it was consistent with the DNA profile found on Karen's jacket and in the blood on the retaining wall. Unfortunately, there was no match to the DNA profile in any criminal database. David, Karen's boyfriend at the time of her death, provided a DNA sample, which was not a match to the DNA found at the crime scene, excluding him as a suspect. He had been considered a potential suspect from the early days of the investigation because he was the last known person to see Karen alive, although Karen's family did not believe he was the killer. After meeting David, Karen's grandmother stated that the teenager lacked the strength and physical maturity needed to carry out such a violent crime. Despite this major development, without a match to the DNA profile, the case again went cold. In 2021, Sunnyvale detective Matthew Hutchison, who was born 2 years after Karen was murdered and had followed the case since he was a child, was the detective assigned to Karen's case. That year, he received a tip that one of the sons of a woman named Rose Aguilera Ramirez may have killed Karen. Detective Hutchison did not elaborate on the nature or source of this tip in the statement of facts he later used to obtain a warrant, although it has been reported that he had been working with genetic genealogists in recent years. Using public records, Detective Hutchison was able to locate a woman named Rose Aguilera Ramirez who had lived in Fresno, California, 160 miles away from Sunnyvale, as early as 1950. She and her husband had 4 sons together, all of whom had been born in Fresno. Between 2021 and 2022, Detective Hutchison's work led to him being able to eliminate 2 of the brothers as Karen's killer. Another brother could not be conclusively eliminated as, according to Detective Hutchison in the later statement of facts, based on the location of his residence, lack of publicly available information about his job and residence history at the time of the murder, and his current lifestyle. I could not do so without jeopardizing the integrity of the investigation. Detective Hutchison therefore focused in on the other remaining brother. He was able to locate a Facebook profile belonging to someone with the same name as one of the two grandchildren named in the obituaries of Rose Aguilera Ramirez and her husband. There were comments on public posts on the page from an individual with the same name as one of the brothers who had been investigated and then eliminated. In replies to these comments, the owner of the profile called this man Uncle Rudy and referred to the other excluded brother by his first name, indicating that he was not their father. Detective Hutchison obtained this individual's birth certificate, which listed a man with the same name and birth year as the brother he was currently investigating as their father. In April of 2022, Detective Hutchison obtained a DNA sample from the owner of the Facebook profile, whose name and gender have not been revealed so as to protect their privacy. Examination of the sample showed very strong statistical support for this individual being the biological child of Karen's killer. It further found that the DNA found at the crime scene was much less statistically likely to be from one of their uncles. Using this evidence as probable cause, Detective Hutchison applied for and was granted a search warrant to obtain a DNA sample from the father of the individual who had provided a sample of their own DNA. An investigator traveled out of state to collect the sample and quickly escorted it back to California for testing. Testing of the sample confirmed that this man's DNA was a match to the DNA found on and near Karen's body. On August 2, 2022, a month before 40th anniversary of murder of Karen's death, an arrest was finally made in the case. 75-year-old Gary Jean Ramirez was arrested at his residence, a guest house in Makawao on the island of Maui in Hawaii. When Detective Hutchison arrived at the home to arrest him, Ramirez was too shocked to say anything beyond, "Oh my gosh." Ramirez is being charged with murder, kidnapping, and rape. If convicted, he faces life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ramirez appeared at a hearing in the Second Circuit Court via video conference from Maui Community Correctional Center on August 10th. He waived his right to an extradition hearing and, according to the deputy prosecutor in Hawaii, authorities in California are working to have Ramirez return to their jurisdiction as quickly as possible. Gary Ramirez's brother, Rudy Ramirez, also lives on the island of Maui and was shocked at his brother's arrest. He has told police that they must have arrested the wrong man. "I've never seen him violent or get angry ever. He wouldn't hurt a fly," Rudy said after his brother's arrest. Gary, Rudy, and their two brothers grew up in what Rudy has described as a dysfunctional middle-class family in Fresno, where their father worked as a heavy equipment operator for the county. According to Rudy, Gary had been their parents' favorite son. Gary served in the United States Air Force in the early 1970s and then lived in various locations throughout California and in Colorado. Rudy Ramirez had moved to Hawaii when he turned 18 and was not in contact with his younger brother at the time of Karen's murder. They were back in contact by the late 1980s when Gary had been living in Fresno with their mother. Rudy convinced his brother to move to Hawaii with him, which Gary ultimately did. Gary married twice and had 2 children after arriving in Hawaii. He worked various jobs, often as a waiter or a bug exterminator, over the following years. By the time of his arrest, a hip injury had left him unable to work and reliant on disability payments. In his youth, he had been just shy of 6 feet tall, but by 2022, his health problems and age had caused him to lose about 5 inches in height. Karen's boyfriend at the time of her death, David, has been haunted by his decision to not stay with Karen while she waited for the bus for the past 4 decades. Her murder has left him exceptionally preoccupied with safety and with keeping his friends and family members safe. For 40 years, I have suffered heartache from the horrific loss of a beautiful girl whom I was falling in love with. I hope this brings some closure for her family, myself, and her other loved ones, he wrote in an email to the Mercury News after Ramirez's arrest. Karen's father and older sister both passed away prior to the arrest being made in her case. From her home in Florida, Karen Zand has expressed her gratitude for authorities never giving up on Karen's case. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. 28-year-old Nancy Bilic resided in an apartment at Arden Way and Bell Street in Sacramento and worked as a court reporter. Her fiancé, Farah Salami, was also involved in the criminal justice system, serving as a public defender. Salami would later receive national recognition for defending serial killer Richard Chase and would eventually become Sacramento's chief public defender. On the evening of October 25, 1970, Nancy and Farah enjoyed dinner together before returning to Nancy's apartment. They were set to marry the following month. Farris left Nancy's apartment around 11:30 p.m. to return to his own home. When he left, Nancy was in bed. The sliding glass door to her second-floor balcony was left slightly open as she had a cat she allowed to come in and out as it pleased throughout the night. The following morning, October 26th, Nancy did not report to work, which was not typical behavior for her. One of her co-workers called her own son and asked him to go to Nancy's apartment to check on her. Her son found the apartment manager who used his key to go into Nancy's apartment with him. Then, they discovered Nancy's body in her bedroom. She had been stabbed almost 30 times with such force that she had nearly been decapitated. Defensive wounds indicated that she had fought against her killer. Authorities were able to determine that the murderer had accessed the apartment by climbing up to Nancy's balcony and entering through the slightly ajar sliding door, and that he had wrapped tape around all of his fingers to prevent him from leaving fingerprints behind. Nancy's murder raised concerns that a serial killer may have been operating in the area as one of Nancy's neighbors. Another young woman with a successful career who was about to be married had been killed just 7 months earlier. 23-year-old Judith Hikari was last seen leaving her shift as a nurse at Sutter Memorial Hospital on March 7, 1970. She had called her fiancé at 11:30 p.m. to tell him she was on her way home, but she never arrived. Her fiancé eventually went out to look for her and discovered her car parked in its assigned spot, but no sign of Judith herself. This led to concerns that she had been abducted as she walked from her car to her apartment, which was only a block away from where Nancy lived. Hikers found Judith's body weeks later in a shallow grave in Placer County. Unfortunately, even after decades passed and DNA technology advanced, DNA could not be used to either confirm or disprove a connection between the two cases. The evidence from Judith's case that potentially contained DNA from her killer was accidentally damaged and could not be tested. A source of DNA evidence was still available in Nancy's case, thankfully. Police had identified a blood trail that started on Nancy's balcony and continued onto the sidewalk below and around the buildings of the complex before ending in the parking lot. Investigators believed that the killer had cut himself while attacking Nancy and left the trail of blood behind as he made his way to a car parked in the lot. A DNA profile was developed from the blood left behind in this trail. It was uploaded to the combined DNA index system, but no match was found. Years passed and no profile matching that from Nancy's crime scene was ever uploaded to the database. Then in 2019, investigators from the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Team and the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office began using forensic genetic genealogy in their investigations. The effort ultimately helped identify what they believed to be the killer's family. One member of this family seemed like a promising suspect as he had lived in the same apartment complex as Nancy at the time of her murder. One of his relatives provided a sample of their DNA, which, based on the amount of DNA they shared with the profile from the crime scene, confirmed that the potential suspect was the person whose blood was left at the scene. On August 10, 2022, the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office announced that after more than 50 years, they had identified Nancy's killer as Richard John Davis. Davis had been 27 years old at the time of the murder. He had no known violent criminal history, although he had once been arrested for driving while intoxicated. Unfortunately, Davis could not be charged with Nancy's murder as he had died in Sacramento County in November of 1997. It is believed that his death was the result of complications from alcoholism. Davis's apartment had been just across the complex's pool from Nancy's, and he most likely could have seen inside her apartment. While they cannot ask Davis about the motive for the crime, police believe he may have developed a fixation on Nancy after watching her in her apartment from his. Davis and his roommate had been among the more than 500 people who were interviewed by police in the month following Nancy's murder, but they had provided alibis for each other. Nancy's fiancé at the time of her death Farah Salami, did not live to see her killer identified. He passed away due to leukemia in 2014 at the age of 84. Nancy's sister, Linda, had started to give up hope that Nancy's case would ever be solved. In a letter read at the press conference announcing Davis's identification, she expressed her gratitude for the work that went into solving the case, as well as her sadness over everything in her life she never got to share with her sister. In 1992, 53-year-old John Stanger was a hardworking employee of Orange County, Florida's maintenance department. He lived in a home on the county's maintenance property on North Forsyth Road. Around 5:30 a.m. on August 10, 1992, John's wife went to wake him up for the day. He was cold to the touch. She realized he had extensive injuries to his head and to his face and was no longer alive. A person of interest was quickly identified in the case. John had a friend named Ronald Cates who had a drug problem and not enough money to support it or his family. John had recently allowed Kate to borrow some of his power tools. Unbeknownst to John, Kate had pawned the tools to get cash. Shortly before he was murdered, John had confronted Kate and told him that he had to finally return the tools. When police went to interview Kate, his daughter answered the door to the home, visibly shaking. Authorities would later learn that her father had ordered her to lie to the police and tell them that he wasn't home while he went to hide under the house. Cades could not avoid the police for long and spoke to them on August 11th, August 18th. There were inconsistencies in his statements and with the timelines provided by his family members. Still, police did not have direct evidence tying him to the crime. During a suicidal incident in 1995, cadets reportedly confessed to killing John in front of his family. His family members reported the confession to police, but given the circumstances of the confession and the continuing lack of corroborating evidence, Katz was not charged with the murder. Decades would pass before investigators had enough evidence to file charges in John's case. On August 10, 2022, 30 years to the day after John's murder, Orange County Sheriff John Mina announced that Ronald Cates had been charged with John's murder and was being held in a North Carolina jail pending extradition back to Florida. Cates's arrest was finally made based on his own actions and the efforts of his own family, who had come to police in 2020 to make sure John's case was still being actively investigated. They all wanted justice for John, even if it meant confirming their husband or father's involvement in the crime. John forthcoming they could be at the time of John's murder because Cates was very abusive and they lived in fear of him. The more casual check-ins with police about the case and its progress turned into more extensive interviews in March of 2022. During these interviews, the family members were able to provide very detailed timelines of the hours around the time of John's murder, which showed that Cates did have time to go to John's house and commit the murder. They also mentioned that cadets liked to walk with a walking stick, a detail which stuck out to investigators. A large stick had been found at the crime scene. Investigators were able to provide a photograph of the stick to Cates' family, and they confirmed that it looked like the walking stick Kate had been using around the time of the murder. The final piece of evidence came in April of 2022 when Cates, again, confessed to the murder. This time, however, he confessed multiple times and his confession was eventually captured on video. Cates was having a mental evaluation in a North Carolina hospital when he allegedly told a nurse that he had killed a man in Florida in 1992. The nurse went to get a security guard, and Cates made the same confession to the guard. The nurse and the guard used the internet to do research to see if the claim could be true and found John Stanger's case on the Orange County Sheriff's website. They then notified local authorities about the confession. Officers from the Salisbury Police Department responded to the hospital and Cates gave them a 10 to 12-minute long confession, which was captured on the officers' body cameras. Cates did not provide a motive for the murder. He did explain that, in his words, he had hit Johnny with a stick. Authorities in Florida re-interviewed Cates and believed they now had sufficient evidence to charge him with first-degree murder, which led to Cates being arrested on August 5th. John's murder is the 13th case solved by the Orange County Sheriff's Office's Cold Case Unit since the unit was established in 2020. Patricia Schmidt, who went by Susie, lived with her family in Seacliff, south of Adelaide in South Australia. In December of 1971, 16-year-old Susie had just finished her leaving exam at Seacombe High School a few weeks earlier. Susie dreamed of one day becoming an airline hostess. For the time being, she had taken a job at the Burger King in Darlington so that she would have money to buy Christmas presents for her family. Susie's 10-year-old brother Frank had already gotten her a present, which sat wrapped under the family Christmas tree. Tragically, Susie never got to open it. Susie had decided to start requesting late-night shifts because they offered better pay. Friday, December 17, 1971, was only the second such shift she worked. That evening, Susie's father, Werner, dropped her off at the home of her friend, Frida, around 6 p.m. when he was on his way to the local German club, where he worked part-time as a barman. Around 8:30, Susie and Frida walked to the Burger King so that Susie could start her shift, before Frida left so that Susie could start working. Susie told her that she would see her the next day. Susie finished work around 1:45 a.m. on December 18th. Her father was supposed to pick her up on his way home, but he was running 10 minutes late. Susie decided to walk home rather than wait any longer. Describing his brief delay, Werner Schmidt would later tell the press, "A few minutes could have made all the difference. I might have saved my daughter's life." Susie never arrived home, and Werner reported her missing at 9:30 that morning, less than 8 hours after she was last seen at work. Around 6:30 that evening, an off-duty police officer was driving in Hallett Cove when he thought he saw something amongst the tall grass along the road. When he got closer, he realized it was the body of a young woman. It was Susie Schmidt. When Susie was found, she was wearing only her boots. Her bra was found hanging from a nearby fence, and her jumper and coat had been draped over her body. The kangaroo skin purse she had been carrying was never located. Evidence showed that Susie had been sexually assaulted prior to being murdered, and the battered state of her body showed that she had died a violent death. Susie was buried next to her mother, who had passed away 5 years earlier. Police believed Susie may have accepted a ride home from her killer. She told a friend that on Tuesday, December 14th, after she worked her first night shift, she had accepted a ride from an unattractive man who was around 30 years old and had severe acne. After Susie got into his car, he suggested that they take her drive to the Adelaide Hills, but Susie said no. He then began driving towards Hallett Cove, but Susie demanded that he drive her home, which he ultimately did. It is unclear if police believe the same man could have potentially given Susie a ride home on the night of her murder, or if he could have been involved in her killing. They cannot say for sure if she willingly accepted a ride or if she was abducted as she walked home. Authorities did have several clues to go on at the scene. They found metal filings from key cutting, microscopic particles that could have been from a shoe repair business, byproducts left behind by welding, particles of electric waste from Phillips Industries, which was located in nearby Henley Beach at the time, iridescent blue paint from a 1971 Holden Monero, and small paint flakes that were pink on one side and white on the other. Following up on these clues did not immediately lead to the case being solved. It would be decades before investigators could properly use additional evidence found at the crime scene, DNA from multiple men. In December of 2021, South Australia Police launched a new appeal for information on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Susie's murder. They also announced a recent major breakthrough that they believed brought them closer to solving the case than they had ever been before. DNA had been found following a new examination of Susie's clothing that had been found with her body. So far, only one of the 2 DNA profiles found on the clothing has been fully developed, but investigators are already using it to try to identify one of the at least 2 men responsible for the sexual assault. The profile was uploaded to the National DNA Database, but no direct match was found. Investigators then turned to familial searching, which has so far identified 8 potential relatives of the suspect. Despite this strong new evidence, the process of building family trees and testing all potential matches will take some time. Police are still hoping for witnesses to come forward with the name of a potential suspect so they can do a direct DNA test, which could potentially allow them to solve the case within a few weeks. A reward of up to $1 million is being offered. For Susie's brother, Frank, the new developments have given him hope that the case will finally be resolved after decades of waiting. He stated, "You're better off having some hope and being disappointed than no hope at all." Just after 6 p.m. on March 6, 1974, police in Hopewell Township, Pennsylvania received a call asking them to report to Lakewood Park. The caller had observed what they initially believed to be a mannequin in a creek running through the park. When the caller got closer, however, they realized that it was in fact the partially clothed body of a young woman lying with her face in the water of the creek. The young woman was 23-year-old Annette Tokars. According to Annette's younger sister, Sharon, Annette was exceptionally friendly. She was a very caring person who would give away the last dollar she had if someone else needed it. Annette and Sharon last spoke about a week before Annette died, and Sharon could tell that something was bothering her. Her sister did not confide in her about what was going on that was upsetting her. Injuries to Annette's body indicated that she had been assaulted prior to her death. A wooden club was found during the search of the park, but it was ultimately found not to have been the instrument used to cause Annette's injuries. Annette's cause of death was found to be forceful drowning. Authorities believe she had been attacked and then dragged down to the creek by her killer, who drowned her in just a few inches of water. Investigators believe she may have been unconscious when she was drowned. Police theorized that Annette had willingly gone to the park with her killer. Her autopsy showed that she had sex before her death, but it could not be determined if the sex was consensual or if Annette had been raped. Annette had been seen out in a variety of places throughout the area the night before her body was found. Police interviewed a number of witnesses to track Annette's movements in the final hours of her life. The last sighting of her was in the town of Aliquippa, just a few miles north of the park where Annette's body would eventually be found. She was last seen being driven away in the car of a man who was an acquaintance of hers. For decades, this man was considered by police to be the prime suspect in the case, although they never found enough evidence to charge him with Annette's murder. In 2022, Beaver County Detective Paul Young meticulously went over all of the evidence in Annette's case, hoping to find previously overlooked clues that could be used to further the investigation. Using an alternative light source, he located DNA evidence in what would later be described to the media as an appropriate area of Annette's clothing, opening up a possible avenue to solving the case. The DNA had degraded since 1974, and the profile that was developed from Annette's clothing was not complete enough to run through the combined DNA index system. Investigators were able to directly compare the profile to samples taken from potential suspects. The main suspect in the case, the acquaintance Annette had last been seen with, had since passed away. However, one of his relatives did provide a voluntary DNA sample. Testing on it showed that the main suspect could not have been the contributor of the DNA. The DNA was then compared to samples from a suspected local serial killer, as well as known sex offenders who were active at the time of the murder in the area. No matches were found. While the DNA profile is not complete enough to run through the criminal database, it is complete enough to attempt to use genetic genealogy to determine who the DNA belongs to. Crime Solvers of Beaver County has agreed to provide the funds for this testing. Hopefully, the effort will soon identify Annette's killer. 56-year-old John Lazaro lived in Rochdale, a suburb south of Brisbane. On April 11, 2012, he was in the living room of his home when two masked men burst inside and shot him multiple times. His 19-year-old daughter witnessed the shooting but was not harmed during the attack. She was able to immediately call for help, but despite her quick action, her father did not survive his injuries. John's dog, a Rottweiler mix named Kilo, was also shot during the attack but survived after undergoing surgery. Police would later describe John's murder as a brutal execution. While his murderers clearly targeted him, investigators could find no motive for the crime, despite interviewing more than 150 individuals in connection to their investigation. Years went on without an arrest in John's case. Police made a renewed appeal to the public for information in April of 2022, on the 10th anniversary of John's murder. At this time, they also released CCTV footage taken near John's home at the time of the murder. The footage shows a tray-back utility vehicle speeding away. The footage was taken less than 100 yards away from John's home, just moments after the time he was shot. Due to how quickly the vehicle left the scene, investigators believe that at least 3 people were involved in the crime, the 2 shooters and a getaway driver. A major break in the case came just months later in June of 2022 when authorities announced that they had located the gun used to kill John. Ballistics testing had confirmed that it was the weapon used in the case. The firearm in question was an unregistered Browning 1932 caliber semi-automatic. The 45-year-old man from New South Wales, who had been in possession of the gun, was questioned by authorities, and his home was searched. The weapon had been in the possession of numerous individuals since 2012, making it difficult to tie it to the person responsible for John's murder. However, Detective Acting Inspector Daniel Cunningham has stated that the discovery of the weapon has accelerated the investigation. Inquiries into the various individuals who had been in possession of the weapon are ongoing. When announcing the discovery of the gun, Queensland Police also stated that they now believe that the shooters had ties to the Bandidos outlaw motorcycle gang. John himself was not involved with the gang. Investigators are hoping that the quickly shifting loyalties amongst gangs like the Bandidos will result in someone with information finally coming forward. There is a $500,000 reward being offered for information that ties all of the new clues and information together to finally solve John's case. Amanda Jane Dowler, affectionately known as Millie Dowler by her family and friends, was born on June 25, 1988, to Bob and Sally Dowler. Millie had an older sister named Gemma, whom she adored and admired. The sisters were very close and were practically best friends. As the youngest in her family, Millie received extra love and attention, which helped her develop into a kind and generous individual. Gemma described her sister as friendly and lively, with a sparkle in her eye. During the early 2000s, Millie attended Heathside School in Weybridge, Surrey. And being the bubbly girl she was, she made a lot of friends, but one of them stood out in particular. Millie met Hannah MacDonald on a school trip to Germany in 2002, and both the girls instantly became friends. In the following years at school, Millie and Hannah became inseparable. They would do everything together, whether it was homework, shopping, or simply lunch. Hannah and Millie became a part of each other's families. By this time, Millie had developed a keen interest in music. Millie loved spending time playing the saxophone, often with her close friends around. Millie was a bright light in the lives of those around. She loved to cheer others up when they were having a bad day and did that effortlessly. On Thursday, March 21, 2002, Millie said goodbye to Hannah and left the Eastside School in Weybridge, Surrey. At 3:07 p.m., she walked to Weybridge railway station with another friend that day. The two girls got off at the Walton on Thames railway station. This was one stop before Hersham, which was Millie's usual stop for her journey home. Millie and her friend had decided to grab a bite together at the station cafe before going home. They just wanted to enjoy a conversation over some good food. Once they were done, Millie called up her father at 3:47 p.m. and informed him about the delay. Before hanging up, she promised him that she would be back home in the next 30 minutes. By 4:0:5, Millie and her friend parted ways and set off home. Unfortunately, only one of the girls made it home that evening. Millie's family awaited her arrival, but hours went by and there were no signs of her. As each minute passed, the Dowlers grew more and more worried about their youngest. Tension had already started to set in, and soon, Millie's family were sure that something awful had happened. At 7 p.m., Bob, Millie's father, called up the authorities in Sussex and reported Millie as missing. Detective Chief Superintendent Craig Denholm from the Police Department of Sussex pulled together a team and led a massive search for Millie. The team included dozens of helicopters and more than 100 police officers searching the fields, streets, and rivers around Hersham. Even the detectives who had earlier worked on abduction cases were called in for help. A week after Millie's disappearance, the police had gathered a few facts related to Millie's disappearance. Millie was last seen around 4:10 p.m. by a friend of Gemma, Millie's sister, when she was waiting at the bus stop. Gemma's friend stated that she recognized Millie when she saw her walking along Station Avenue. Even though there was a CCTV camera located further along the road, it showed no images of Millie. This indicated that Millie had disappeared within minutes after crossing the bus stop. A car, specifically a red Daewoo Nexia, was photographed driving past the same camera at 4:32 p.m., just 20 minutes after Millie was last seen. Although there was no proof that this car had anything to do with Millie's disappearance, the detectives found it suspicious. Police and the Dowler family together made appeals to the media for information about their missing girl, Millie. Millie's parents were interviewed many times, where they urged people to be on the lookout for Millie and come forward if they have any information, which could lead them to her. But sadly, these appeals and interviews were in vain. While nothing helpful came from those interviews, the police started to look at other possibilities. They stated that there was a high chance that Millie was probably not taken by force. They were so sturdy that Millie might have run away on her own will, not necessarily with someone. They backed this theory up by stating that even though a number of people had seen Millie before she went missing, nobody had seen her being in a struggle with anyone. Sally Dowler, Millie's mother, only hoped that her daughter had run away, as it was much better than all the other grim possibilities that occupied her head. However, Sally could not think of a reason why Millie would want to run away. On April 23, 2002, the detectives were informed by the discovery of a body in River Thames, Walton. The news prompted the media to speculate that the remains might be those of Millie. However, the body was identified the following day as that of a 73-year-old woman named Maisie, who went missing in March 2001. An investigation was probed into Maisie's case as well, and her death was not believed to be suspicious. By the time it was June 2002, the police were working extensively searching for Millie. A national tabloid newspaper, The Sun, even offered a reward of £100,000 available for anyone who could lead the authorities to Millie. But sadly, the reward was never claimed. Despite their tireless efforts, the detectives found no clues which could help them locate Millie. On June 25, 2002, it was Millie's 14th birthday, but she remained missing. By the end of that month, the police told Millie's parents that there was a high chance that Millie was dead. In the months that followed Millie's fatting investigation, something strange happened. Millie's family and the detectives monitored Millie's phone, trying to locate it, but instead, they observed some suspicious activity in Millie's voicemail box. They noted that Millie's voicemails were being listened to and deleted. In a time when Millie's family was almost convinced that she was dead, the voicemail activity gave the Mariah hope that maybe Millie is still alive and hiding somewhere. For once, after months, the Dowler family could imagine being reunited with Millie. Bob and Sally, Millie's parents, started sending text and voicemails to Millie's phone, thinking that someday she would reply, telling them about her current condition. However, all hopes the Dowlers had gathered were brutally shattered on September 18, 2002. A few mushroom pickers passing through Yateley Heath Woods, near Yateley, Hampshire, discovered a cold and lifeless body. The body didn't have a single article of clothing on it, and it seemed like nobody had tried to bury the remains at all. Police closed the roads next to the site, where the remains were found. Police officers suspected that the remains to be of Millie. They formed teams, and while some made sure the area was well guarded and secure, the others began a thorough search of the woods. Although a full forensic examination of the scene in the surrounding area was carried out to recover any evidence, no items that Millie had with her at the time of her disappearance, such as her clothing, purse, rucksack, or mobile phone, were ever recovered. However, on September 20, 2002, everyone's worst fears came true, when the dental records examined by a forensic expert confirmed the remains to be of the missing 13-year-old schoolgirl, Millie Dowler. But due to the severity of the decomposition, Millie's cause of death could not be determined, but police were sure it was murder. Sometime after verifying the medical examiner's report, the police officers informed Millie's family of the horrific discovery. Bob, Sally, and Gemma's hearts were shattered to the core. The news broke out and the media covered the full story, spreading it across the whole nation. Thousands of people mourned that day, expressing their sorrow over losing Millie. A couple of weeks later, in October 2002, Millie's family organized a memorial service for her. Dozens gathered in the lawn in front of Millie's school, dropping flowers and paying tributes to Millie. Millie was then laid to rest in Woking Crematorium in Woking Borough, Surrey, on March 21, 2003, exactly a year from the day she disappeared. The discovery of Millie's body led the police to reclassify the case as a homicide investigation, undertaken again by Surrey police. The investigation was code-named Operation Ruby. On November 22, 2002, the detective set up a roadblock near the spot where Millie's body was discovered. The Surrey Police Department didn't want to leave any stones unturned, and hence, re-examined the crime scene and the surrounding area to make sure they didn't miss anything out. They questioned around 6,000 motorists in the area, but no new clues or leads were discovered. Knowing that in cases such as Millie's, a family member could most likely be the perpetrator. They even consider Bob Dowler, Millie's father, a suspect. However, this string of investigation was quickly dropped, as there was no evidence linking Bob to Millie's murder. The detectives apologize for the missed opportunities their attention to this track may have caused. On March 23, 2003, detectives discovered the DNA of an unidentified male on one of Millie's clothes found in her bedroom. This gave detectives the impression that Millie's killer might have met her before, but just within 3 months, this link was ruled out by the detectives. They never shared the reason behind this decision. Even after the discovery of Millie's body, the Dowler family's suffering didn't end. The investigation into Millie's case was turning out to be a frustrating one for the detectives, but mostly for Millie's family. Beginning in 2003 itself, Millie's family and the detectives started receiving misleading and false information. This insensitive and foolish behavior not only hurt the Dowler family sentiments, but also made the investigators go around in circles and lose valuable time. Gemma, Millie's older sister, started receiving some mischievous letters. In these letters, an unidentified person with the mischievous tone claimed to have killed Millie. He even went on to give death threats to Gemma, warning that she too would meet the same fate as her sister. Even though Gemma was in a fragile state of mind, she didn't hesitate to report these letters to the authorities. The detectives were quick to follow up and nab the author of those nasty letters. He was identified as a man named Paul Hughes. It was confirmed that he had no relation to either Gemma or Millie. Paul had sent those letters to Gemma while he was already imprisoned for indecently assaulting a 12-year-old girl. The prison service later apologized for not screening the mail effectively. Paul was convicted for his crimes against Gemma and was given an additional sentence of 5 years behind bars. Around the same time that year, a woman named Leanne Newman of Tewkesbury, Gloucestershire repeatedly phoned Millie's parents, school, and the police. Over the phone calls, Leanne pretended to be Millie. In April 2003, she was jailed for 5 months after pleading guilty to 5 counts of making phone calls to cause annoyance, inconvenience, or needless anxiety. Every time Bob Sally and Gemma Dowler tried to put behind Millie's tragic death and move on with their lives, some maniac would show up and shatter their healing process. For the Dowlers, it was like someone was rubbing salt on their wounds. On July 6, 2005, a man named Levi Belfield caught the attention of the detective's eyes. Levi was a tall, hefty man in his early 30s back in 2005, who was born and raised in southwest London. Levi Belfield was also a serial killer who had been convicted for the murders of 19-year-old Marcia McDonnell in February 2003 and 22-year-old Emile Delagrange in August 2004, and the attempted murder of 18-year-old Kate Sheedy sometime in 2004. For these crimes, which clearly took place after Millie's murder, Levi was already serving a whole life tariff, a custodial sentence handed out for the most heinous crimes, which meant that he would spend his entire life in jail. The detectives took a closer look at Levi's crimes and noted that some of them had taken place around the area that Millie was abducted from. They suspected Levi to be involved in Millie's murder as well and decided to question him. After a few minutes into the questioning, Levi was beginning to get uncomfortable with the line of questioning, which was evident from his body language and short responses. The fact that Levi never denied killing Millie, that he was somehow connected to her murder, but this wasn't enough. They needed something solid, and for that, they reached out to Levi's past lovers. Joanna, an ex-partner of Levi, shared her disturbing experience with him and told how dangerous he was as a person. One of Levi's known surviving victims, Kate Sheedy, shared her nightmare story as well. She stated that she was unaware that Levi had been following her in his white van while she was in the bus, and as soon as she got off the bus and walked into an isolated area, Levi rammed his van into her. After some turbulence and a few stirrups, there was finally some valuable progress being made in the investigation into Millie's murder. However, things turned shaky once again in 2006 when a man named Gary Farr of Ratford, Nottinghamshire started sending emails to Millie's parents and friends repeatedly. In those emails, Gary claimed that Millie was still alive. He said that she had been smuggled out of the country to work as an entertainer at nightclubs in Poland. He even claimed that Millie's death was merely a facade to cover up what actually had happened. As a result of these misleading emails, Gary was sectioned indefinitely under the Mental Health Act on October 19, 2006, for being a serious psychological danger to the public after admitting a charge of harassment. A confirmatory investigation was launched in the following years, and on March 30, 2010, Levi was charged with Millie's abduction and murder. And as a result, an 8-year-old long search for Millie's murderer was finally over. On October 6, 2010, Levi appeared virtually in court via video and was formally charged with 1 count of attempted abduction, 1 count of abduction, 1 count of disposal of evidence, and 1 count of murder. Before the trial began, Justice Secretary Kenneth Clark rejected calls for a review of Levi's past criminal cases. Justice Kenneth said that, while Levi had been convicted of previous murders, he had to be presumed innocent in Millie's case and be found guilty by a jury in a full court process. He believed that bringing up Levi's charges for the murders of Marcia McDonnell and Emile Delagrange in the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy would prejudice the trial. To keep that from happening, the court did not allow evidence to be introduced of Levi's obsession with schoolgirls and his attempt to abduct and assault them. Levi's trial began on May 10, 2011, and concluded 6 weeks later on June 23, 2011, with the jury finding him guilty. Levi was handed another life sentence on Friday, June 24, 2011, for abducting and murdering Millie Dowler. During the course of Levi's trial in Millie's case, another old case was brought to light. Levi was being suspected of an attempted abduction of an 11-year-old girl named Rachel Collis. The incident allegedly took place in 2002, on March 20th, when Rachel was offered a lift by a man in a red car in the Walton area. However, the request for Levi's trial on this case was dismissed due to newspapers publishing articles with preconceived notions, but the judge ordered that the charge should remain on file so it can be properly investigated later. After Levi's sentencing, the Dowler family strongly criticized the treatment they faced during the trial. Millie's sister, Gemma, described the day that her parents were cross-examined by Levi's defense lawyer as the worst day of her life. Sally, Millie's mother, told reporters that the trial had been a truly awful experience for her and her family. She said that they had to hear Millie's name being defamed in court. As Levi's defense lawyers tried to portray Millie as an unhappy, depressed young girl, Sally reassured that Millie was none of those things at all. She was a happy, vivacious, fun-loving girl. Sally was upset that her family's life had been scrutinized and laid open for everyone to inspect. The Dowlers were snatched of their right to privacy and made to sit through the painful trial, day after day, in order to get an evil man convicted of their beloved Millie's brutal murder. Bob, Millie's father, criticized how Levi refused to appear physically in court and to give evidence for his sentencing. He was disgusted by the fact that he was questioned about his relationship with his own daughter. Bob added that his family had to pay too high a price for Levi's conviction. Bob was hurt that the trial had been a truly mentally scarring experience for him and his family. Bob also revealed that when he and his family were being questioned, it made them feel as if they were the ones on trial, not Levi. Bob further shamed the judicial system for being so loaded in favor of the perpetrator of the crime. When the news that the Dowlers were mistreated and harshly cross-examined in the courtroom broke, it led to a debate over how victims and witnesses were treated in court. On July 4, 2011, it was discovered that Millie's voicemails had been accessed and altered by journalists working for a newspaper that went by the name of News of the World. The newspaper's private investigator, Glenn McClare, was particularly criticized. It was revealed that during the police investigation into the newspaper's phone hacking activities, detectives discovered that journalists had deleted some messages in Millie's voicemail box, which could have been potential evidence in Millie's case. They did so because the mailbox was full and they wanted to free up space for new messages so they could listen to them. This was the reason why, back in 2002, after noticing activity in Millie's voicemail box. The Dowler family thought that Millie was still alive, even after her disappearance, which, as it turned out, was not the case at all. The phone hacking scandal earned the anger of the Prime Minister, David Cameron, who called it a truly dreadful act. In response to the British public's outcry, several inquiries were conducted into phone hacking and media ethics. The newspaper itself was closed in 2011. As a direct result of the outrage, the Prime Minister David Cameron sat down with Millie's family to have a discussion over the press hacking incident. Bob and Sally, Millie's parents, announced they would pursue a claim for damages against the News of the World. In September 2011, it was reported that the Dowler family had been offered £2 million in personal damages. In January 12th, it was reported that Surrey police and other police forces were made aware soon after Millie's death that News of the World staff had accessed her voicemail box, but the detectives did not publicly address this information. Instead, a senior Surrey officer invited the newspaper staff to a meeting to discuss the case and settle things in secret. Millie's family felt even more cheated after learning about this situation. A red Daewoo Nexio, which was photographed driving past the same camera that captured Millie shortly after she was abducted, belonged to Levi's then-girlfriend, Emma Mills. Levi said that he was driving the car at that time. On January 27, 2016, Surrey police announced that Levi had admitted to the abduction, assault, and murder of Millie Dowler. However, on February 12, 2016, Levi changed his story and declined that he had ever confessed to assaulting and murdering Millie. Millie's death had a great impact on her parents, Bob and Sally. Even though their beloved daughter was now gone, they wanted to make sure that nothing similar would happen to any other child. Sally and Bob launched a charity called Millie's Fun on the day of her memorial service. The charity provided risk assessment advice to teenagers, youth workers, and educators, and aimed at promoting public safety of children and young people. About a couple of years after Millie's body was discovered, Quayside School, where Millie was a student once, gathered a team together and built a memorial garden for Millie and named it Amanda Dowler Memorial Garden. It followed a paved pattern around borders, planted with flowers and shrubs, and had benches for people to stop by and remember Millie. Sally and Bob Dowler, together with her sister Gemma, were present at the moving ceremony when the garden was first opened for the public. The school staff and some governors also attended. The Reverend Nick Whitehead concluded the official opening with a prayer and a blessing. The principal thanked all the individuals, businesses, and organizations that offered a helping hand in converting the dream of making a memorial garden for Millie into a reality. School principal Glenn Willoughby said that he believed that a lot of people in Walton needed a place of peace and tranquility. At the school, the students and staff can visit to remember Millie and to have some space and time to reflect on anything that may be on their mind. On June 29, 2017, Gemma, Millie's sister, released a book dedicated to Millie entitled it, My Sister Millie. Gemma wrote the book in loving memory of her little sister and to express how much she missed her. In the book, Gemma talked about how Millie's chance at having a beautiful childhood and life was snatched away from her, and how it impacted the Dowler family. Gemma also shed light on her family's journey of going from extreme pain to healing and achieving closure. It came as cold comfort to the Dowlers in the family of Levi's other victims that he will never be free again. Levi became the only person ever to have been handed 2 separate whole life tariffs in British history. Levi is behind bars at Prison Franklin in County Durham. The prison is commonly referred to as the Monster Mansion due to many of its inmates being convicted murderers and high risk in general. Levi has now converted to Islam and now goes by the name Yusuf Rahim, but no matter what he does, he will never set foot out in the free world. Even after more than 20 years of Millie's disappearance, Hannah MacDonald, Millie's best friend from school, is still close to Millie's family. For years, Hannah bottled up her grief thinking about how her best friend was robbed of a wonderful life. Hannah still misses Millie, who will always hold a special place in her heart. Do you think there are any more unsolved murders that Belfield might have committed? How do you think the detectives handled Millie's case? Could they have been more efficient? Let us know your thoughts. On the morning of June 16, 1974, a man and his sons ventured into a swampy area of Singer Island on the eastern coast of Florida in search of driftwood. Instead, they discovered the skeletal remains of a young woman among the mangroves. The body had been tied to a tree with wire, and only skeletal remains and scattered scraps of clothing were found. With only bones to work with, authorities struggled to provide a description or make an identification. Efforts to use dental records for identification were unsuccessful. It was estimated that the young woman was between 13 and 19 years old, weighed between 83 and 133 pounds, and stood between 4 feet 11 inches and 5 feet 2 inches tall. The cause of death could not be conclusively determined, but it was initially believed she had died between 8 weeks and 8 months prior to the discovery of her remains. Unable to identify the Jane Doe and notify her family, authorities were forced to bury her remains. For decades, the Jane Doe remained unidentified, but advances in technology eventually allowed investigators to renew their efforts to determine her identity. Her remains were exhumed in April of 2014 in hopes of obtaining a sample of her DNA. Her DNA profile was successfully developed in 2015. There were no matches to it in any database, but investigators continued to find other uses for the profile. They were able to use the profile to exclude several missing women as potential matches. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office released a new facial reconstruction, showing what their Jane Doe may have looked like while alive in 2019, but no one called in, reporting that they recognized her. In December 2021, the remains were sent to Othram, a Texas-based laboratory, to develop a DNA profile so as to use genetic genealogy in the case. In March of 2022, genealogists presented the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office with several potential leads to follow up on. On June 2, 2022, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office announced that the Singer Island Jane Doe had finally been identified. Her name was Susan Galepool. Susan was born on February 12, 1957. At the end of 1972, when she was 15 years old, she had dropped out of high school and was splitting her time living with her family in a trailer park near Fort Lauderdale and with a friend who had an apartment nearby. Susan's family reported her missing just before Christmas of 1972. When they first could not contact Susan, they weren't sure if she had left town on her own accord or if something had happened to her. She was known to hitchhike and had left once before. However, her clothing and belongings all remain at her friend's apartment, and Susan's sister, Patty, has stated that she knew something was wrong as soon as she saw Susan's purse left behind on the friend's couch. In 2022, nearly 50 years after Susan disappeared, her mother was still alive and now in her 90s. She provided the DNA sample that confirmed that the remains found on Singer Island belonged to her daughter. Police believe that Susan may have been a victim of Gerard John Schaefer, a suspected serial killer and a former Martin County Sheriff's deputy. Prior to joining the sheriff's office, Schaefer had been a police officer with the Wilton Manors Police Department and had been fired for allegedly violating the Civil Service Code. He was accused of pulling over female motorists for traffic violations so he could get their basic information and then using police resources to obtain further personal information about them and contacting them to ask them out on dates. In July of 1972, 18-year-old Nancy Trotter and 17-year-old Paula Sue Wells were vacationing in Florida. While they were hitchhiking near the beach, they encountered a Martin County Sheriff's deputy, Gerard Schaefer. He told them that hitchhiking was illegal in the area, which was a lie. After radioing in to report that he would be transporting the two teenagers, he had them get into his vehicle and drove them to where they were staying in Stewart. He offered to give them a ride to Jensen Beach the following day because it was in his patrol area. The next day, he met them at the agreed-upon meeting spot in civilian clothes and driving his own car. Instead of driving Nancy and Sue to the beach, he drove them to an old shed on Hutchinson Island where he handcuffed, bound, and gagged both of the young women. At this time, neither of them attempted to escape as Schaefer threatened to kill the girl left behind if one of them tried to run. He further threatened to rape them, hold them for ransom, and sell them into slavery. Schaefer then tied Nancy and Sue to separate trees, not in view of each other, and put nooses around each of their necks. They had to balance on the exposed roots of the tree so as to not fall and be hanged. Schaefer believed this was enough to keep the young woman secure and left them there. While he was gone, Both girls were able to chew away at the ropes to give them enough slack to escape their nooses without injury. Nancy hid for half an hour, fearing Schaefer was still in the area. She eventually decided to run and fought her way through thick vegetation, fearing Schaefer would find her if she stayed on a path. When the trees became too thick for her to get through, she decided to swim in the nearby Indian River because she knew it would eventually take her to a road. Still handcuffed, she was able to swim using just her legs. When she finally made it to the road, she walked out of the water and began calling out to passing cars. The first car to stop was driven by Martin County Sheriff Robert Crowder. He had been out looking for Nancy because Sue had been found 45 minutes earlier and told authorities that her friend was in trouble. Sue had managed to get to a road after getting herself free, and a truck driver had stopped to help her. Sheriff Crowder was Schaefer's boss. After Schaefer realized the girls had escaped, he called the sheriff and told him, "I've done something foolish. You're going to be mad at me." Schaefer claimed that he had gotten carried away trying to teach the two young women a lesson about the dangers of hitchhiking. The sheriff did not believe him, and neither did the courts. Schaefer was arrested and charged with aggravated assault and false imprisonment. Schaefer was released on $15,000 bail. He was still free on September 27, 1972. The last day, 17-year-old Susan Place and 16-year-old Georgia Jessup were seen alive. The two teenagers had become friends at Fort Lauderdale's Adult Education Center, where they were both students. Around 8:30 p.m. on the evening of 27th, the two left Susan's home in Oakland Park, near Fort Lauderdale, with an older man to go play guitar at a nearby beach. Susan told her mother, Lucille, that her friend's name was Jerry Shepard. Lucille was suspicious of an older man spending time with two teenage girls, so she took note of his car, a blue-green Datsun, and wrote down his license plate number when he picked up the girls. The car was registered to Schaefer. Lucille would also later identify Schaefer as the man who the girls left with that day from a photographic lineup. George's father, who had met the man known as Jerry Shepard, also identified him as Schaefer. Susan and George's remains were found on April 1, 1973. A father and son were out searching for discarded aluminum cans on Hutchinson Island when they came across the remains. Susan had been shot in the jaw, and according to detectives, evidence indicated that both girls had been tied to a tree and butchered. The location where they were found was only 6 miles away from where Schaefer had taken Nancy and Sue. While the two girls had gone missing at the end of September, investigators did not trace the license plate number provided by Lucille Place until the end of March, just a week before the remains were found. By this time, Schaefer was serving his 6-month sentence for the one charge of assault. He pleaded guilty to over the attack on Nancy and Sue. He was questioned about the disappearance, but denied knowing Georgia or Susan. When their remains were located just a few days later, he became the prime suspect in their murders. Schaefer was indicted on May 18, 1973 and held without bond. He was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder that October. Schaefer was convicted during the period of time when the death penalty could not be imposed due to a Supreme Court ruling. The presiding judge later stated that he would have sentenced Schaefer to death had he been legally allowed to. Instead, Schaefer received 2 life sentences with the possibility of parole in 2018 when he would have been 72. Schaefer maintained his innocence in the murders, claiming he was set up by one of his defense attorneys who did go on to marry one of Schaefer's ex-wives. He was also critical of prosecutors using his creative writing as evidence in the case. They claimed that Schaefer's stories were thinly veiled accounts of actual crimes he committed. Schaefer claimed they were just art. However, after his high school girlfriend published a collection of these stories he had written, he did imply in a letter sent from prison that the stories were, in fact, confessions. Schaefer was found stabbed to death in his cell at the Florida State Prison on December 3, 1995. He had 43 stab wounds as well as defensive wounds on his hands and arms. His eyes had been stabbed badly enough to leave one of them completely destroyed, and he had 6 broken ribs. Prison officials identified his killer as Vincent Rivera, who was serving a life sentence for 2 murders he committed in February of 1990. Rivera's reported motive was his displeasure at Schaefer taking 2 cups of hot water from the water fountain rather than just one a few days before he was killed. Georgia Jessup's mother, Shirley told reporters that she wanted to send Schaefer's killer a present, and that while she was always confident that her daughter's murderer would get what was coming to him, she wished it had happened sooner. While Schaefer was only ever convicted of 2 murders, he is considered a suspect in as many as 30 murders, some dating back to 1969, according to Circuit Judge C.P. Trowbridge, who presided over Schaefer's double murder trial. Evidence ties him to crimes across the country. When police searched Schaefer's mother's home in Fort Lauderdale after Susan Place and Georgia Jessup's remains were found, they found items, including jewelry, identification documents, a diary, and gold teeth belonging to at least 5 missing or murdered young women. The remains of other young women known to hitchhike in the area have also been found in similar circumstances as Schaefer's known victims. However, authorities never felt they had enough conclusive evidence to charge Schaefer with any more murders. Robert Stone, who prosecuted Schaefer for the murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, described him as the most sexually deviant person I had ever seen. He made Ted Bundy look like a Boy Scout. Bill Haggerty, who interviewed Schaefer for the Violent Crime Apprehension Program during his tenure as an FBI agent, later stated that out of all the serial killers from across the country he interviewed during his time with the FBI, Schaefer was easily in the top 5 of the sickest individuals he talked with. According to Schaefer's statements to psychiatrists while he was incarcerated, he began associating pain and sex around the age of 12. He would tie himself to trees and would become sexually excited from hurting himself. Soon, that excitement was transferred to the idea of hurting women. His short-lived first marriage ended when his first wife filed for citing extreme cruelty. As with the numerous other potential victims of Schaefer, investigators have no concrete physical evidence connecting him to Susan Poole's murder. They believe he may be responsible for her murder purely based on circumstances. Susan was known to hitchhike, and Schaefer was known to pick up hitchhikers. Susan's remains were found tied to a tree, as were Schaefer's 2 known victims. Furthermore, while Schaefer was sentenced in the assault case involving Nancy Trotter and Sue Wells on December 22, 1972, the judge allowed him to delay the start of his sentence until after the holidays, meaning he was not in custody when Susan disappeared. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office is still searching for further evidence to see if Schaefer can be tied conclusively to Susan's murder. They are hoping that friends of Susan's from around the time of her murder may be able to help them connect Susan and Schaefer. In a Facebook post, they announced that they are hoping to locate and interview 3 of Susan's friends, Julie Hunt, Michelle Williamson, and Greg Anderson. They are asking that these 3 individuals contact Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office Detective Bill Springer. According to Detective Springer, Susan's mother and siblings were glad to know what became of her after so long, but he hopes to be able to give them further closure by being able to definitively identify her killer. In 1981, 34-year-old Sylvia Quail lived on South Ogden Street in Cherry Hills Village, Colorado, south of Denver. She enjoyed studying history, especially researching the work of Wesley Quail, a noted architect and Sylvia's uncle. Sylvia was able to incorporate her interest in architecture into her career, working as a secretary at an architectural firm. Sylvia was very artistic and ambitious, which led to her not being satisfied with just one job. She used her cooking and baking skills to start her own business, which specialized in creating wedding cakes. Her other artistic skills include making pottery, and she created pieces that are still treasured by her sister today. Sylvia was very close with her family, which included her parents and her younger sister. Her parents' home was only about 150 feet away from her own, and she had coffee with them every morning. Sylvia did not make it to this daily coffee date on August 4, 1981. She was last heard from around 11 p.m. the night before when she spoke to her sister on the phone. Just before 8 a.m. on 4th, Sylvia's father, William, went over to her home. When William arrived at the home, the storm drawer and front door were both open and he could see inside the living room from outside. His daughter's body was immediately visible on the floor. Sylvia was lying on the floor, her spread legs facing the door. She was nude from the neck up. Her red, long-sleeved shirt had been pulled up so it covered her face from the nose up, and her arms were still entangled in the garment above her head. A white towel had been thrown over her to cover the rest of her face and her neck. William quickly called for help, But he could not do so from Sylvia's house as someone had cut the phone line inside the house, as well as pulled down the phone lines outside. William moved the towel on his daughter's face to try to cover up her body before police arrived. He told them how he originally found it, and they moved the towel back to its original position to properly document the scene. Sylvia had been sexually assaulted, stabbed, and shot. Red marks approximately the size of fingers on her neck indicated that her killer also tried to strangle her. Extensive injuries to her hands and fingers showed that Sylvia had aggressively tried to fight off her attacker. Sylvia's cause of death was ultimately ruled to have been the blood loss caused by the 3 stab wounds she had sustained, which had pierced her heart and both of her lungs. The .22 caliber gunshot to the top of her head was ruled a secondary cause of her death. A bloody knife was found a few feet away from Sylvia's body, as was a pair of underwear. A small pool of blood was found behind the home's front door, and what court documents would later describe as a significant amount of blood was found on Sylvia's pillow in her bedroom. Drops of blood were found between the bed and the bedroom door. The killer appeared to have first attempted to enter the home through Sylvia's bedroom window, a conclusion authorities arrived at based on a hole cut into the lower corner of the window screen. Evidence indicated that the killer's successful entry into the home was made through the bathroom window. The screen from that window had been removed and there was a pry mark visible at the bottom of the window. The screen was found 50 to 75 yards away from the house, tossed into tall weeds. Several items that were most likely from inside the bathroom, including a can of hairspray and 2 hair curlers, were found outside the home, underneath the bathroom window. Numerous items of evidence that would later be used to test for DNA were collected at the scene. These items included the bloody towel found covering the lower portion of Sylvia's face, the orange area rug upon which Sylvia's body had been lying, the knife, and the underwear found near her body. In addition, an internal vaginal swab and swabs from Sylvia's breasts were taken during her autopsy and preserved. In total, more than 140 pieces of evidence were collected and preserved in the case. New technologies were applied to the examination of this evidence as they were developed in the years following Sylvia's murder. In 1983, 2 years after Sylvia was killed, forensic technicians re-examined the carpet from her home with an alternative light source. When they did so, they were able to identify foreign biological evidence in the area of the rug that was close to where Sylvia's body had been found. This section of carpet was submitted to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for testing in 1995. 5 years later, in 2000, the CBI was able to develop a male DNA sample from the carpet. However, when they uploaded the profile to the FBI's combined DNA index system, the search returned no matches. In the early days of DNA testing by law enforcement, the technology had been used to discredit a confession from a known attention-seeking killer. In 1983, while he was imprisoned on unrelated charges, Addis Toole claimed to have killed Sylvia and reportedly described the hedges and bushes outside of her home to prove his involvement. Toole and his criminal associate Henry Lee Lucas famously claimed responsibility for 100 of crimes committed across the country, apparently for the notoriety it afforded them and the benefits like food and cigarettes they received while working with various law enforcement agencies. Their claims have largely been disproven. Toole was eventually charged with Sylvia's murder, but in 1993, DNA from another piece of evidence excluded him as Sylvia's killer, and the charges were dropped. Toole died while incarcerated in Florida in 1996. In January of 2020, police in Cherry Hills Village began working with United Data Connect, a Colorado-based genetic genealogy company founded by former Denver District Attorney Mitch Morrisy. Using GED-Match and Family Tree DNA, 2 public genealogical databases, United Data Connect was able to provide police with the identity of someone who was a possible match to the DNA from the crime scene on May 26th of that same year. In addition to the genealogical evidence pointing to this individual, United Data Connect was also able to provide evidence that he had been living in the city of Englewood, just to the west of Cherry Hills Village before, during, and after the time of Sylvia's murder. The potential suspect was living in Cozad, Nebraska at the time. In January of 2021, an investigator from United Data Connect traveled to Nebraska in hopes of surreptitiously collecting a sample of this individual's DNA. He retrieved 2 bags of trash from the dumpster of the apartment building where the potential suspect lived. The bags contained mail addressed to the potential suspect, indicating that he was the person who had owned the items in the bags. From the 2 bags of trash, the investigator was able to obtain 15 items that potentially had the possible suspect's DNA on them and turned them over to the district attorney's office back in Colorado. The evidence was then taken to an evidence technician with the Cherry Hills Village Police Department. The items were submitted for testing, and a male DNA profile was developed from a can of vanilla Coke found in one of the bags of trash. It was a match to the DNA found on multiple pieces of evidence collected from Sylvia's body and her home following her murder. On February 10, 2021, nearly 40 years after Sylvia was murdered, 62-year-old David Dwayne Anderson was arrested in Nebraska and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in connection to Sylvia's case. One count alleged that Sylvia was killed after deliberation, and the other alleged that she was killed during the commission of another felony. Anderson had been just 22 years old at the time of the murder. While he had never been arrested for violent crimes, he did have a criminal record. Between 1981 and 1986, he was arrested on 8 separate occasions for committing commercial and residential burglaries. During one of the residential burglaries, he had entered the home by discarding the screen to a bedroom window. Anderson agreed to an interview with investigators, during which he denied knowing Sylvia Quail and stated that he did not know how his DNA ended up in her home. Anderson's first trial began in March of 2022. During opening statements, Anderson's defense team argued that he and Sylvia had consensual sex, explaining the presence of his semen on so many of the pieces of evidence from the scene. His DNA had been found in the swab taken from Sylvia's breast and in the semen found in her vaginal swab on the carpet near her body and on the towel, which also contained Sylvia's blood that had been left on her face. The defense also suggested that the real killer was an abusive boyfriend of Sylvia's who had raped and beaten her several years before her murder. She had told her family at that time that if anything happened to her, he was responsible. Anderson's lawyers claimed that police had not taken the boyfriend seriously as a suspect despite being told about him by a member of Sylvia's family. Sylvia had dated this man on and off for years, and they had begun seeing each other again several months before she was killed. The boyfriend's DNA was reportedly eventually found on a knife found in Sylvia's home, but not on the bloody knife found near her body. All of the foreign DNA samples found on or near Sylvia's body belonged to Anderson. There was no commingling of Anderson's DNA with any other individual aside from Sylvia, whose blood was found on the towel that also contained Anderson's semen. After 5 days of deliberation, the jury announced that they could not reach a unanimous verdict, leading the presiding judge to declare a mistrial. A new trial was held just months later in June of 2022. On June 30th, 2022, a jury found Anderson guilty of both counts of first-degree sentenced on August 4th. While current Colorado state law does not allow for parole following a conviction for first-degree murder, Anderson has to be sentenced under the guidelines in place at the time of the murder, meaning that even if he receives a life sentence, he will be eligible for parole after 20 years. Sylvia's parents did not live to see their daughter's killer identified and convicted. William Quail passed away in 1999, and Mary Quail passed away a decade later. Sylvia's sister and brother-in-law were able to finally learn who had taken Sylvia away from them more than 4 decades earlier. Following Anderson's conviction, District Attorney John Kellner stated, "This verdict should give hope to all those who are still waiting for justice. And for any killer who still thinks they got away, know that we are still coming for you." Susan Morrisy Ledgard was known for always having at least 2 books on the go. Her passion for reading began in childhood and became a constant influence throughout her life, shaping many aspects of her adult years. Naturally brilliant, Susan's intelligence was admired by her siblings, but sometimes found intimidating. Rather than skimming through her books, she absorbed the material thoroughly and continually expanded her knowledge. Her books were filled with extensive highlights and notes, reflecting her deep engagement with the texts. Susan did not become lost in the books she read, instead using what she learned from them to follow her passions and benefit others. She had a deep compassion and concern for others, whether or not they were human. She became a vegetarian at the age of 8 out of concern for animals, and as an adult, she campaigned to save sea lions in San Francisco. She was well versed in both national and international issues from a young age and remained highly politically aware and active throughout her life. Politically aware and active throughout her life. While she was aware of and concerned about the variety of issues facing people across the United States and around the world, Susan never lost sight of those who were closest to her. She cared deeply about the well-being of the most important people in her life, particularly her brother and two sisters. Her family valued her complexity and the depth of her knowledge, and she drew attention from even mere acquaintances because she was so obviously an interesting person to speak with. Susan ultimately incorporated her love of language and literature into her career, working as a teacher for over 20 years. She was drawn to teaching English and language arts at the high school level because working with older students allowed her to fully and deeply dive into literature and explore language with them. She was very popular with her students because she made them feel confident in expressing their own opinions and viewpoints on the books they were studying rather than demanding a standard response. Susan's career as an educator had taken her to numerous places before she arrived at Academy Park High School in Sharon Hill, Pennsylvania, where she would teach for 13 years. She taught English for a year in Prague and then went on to earn her master's degree and teach in California for a number of years. Despite her travels, Susan's favorite place did not change. She felt the most like herself at the beaches of Stone Harbor, New Jersey, spending time with her family at her mother's home there. Susan's sister Meg would bring her family from California to the house at the shore for 3 weeks every July, and since Susan was off work for the summer, she was able to spend almost the entirety of their trip there with them. In 2019, that trip to the shore ended on July 20th for Susan, and she returned to the home she shared with her husband, Ben Ledgard, in Wilmington, Delaware. Just 3 days later, on July 23rd, at approximately 7:30 a.m., Susan's body was discovered in the Brandywine River near Northeast Boulevard in Wilmington. A short time later, her black 2016 Honda Civic was found parked on Walker's Mill Road near the Rising Sun Lane Bridge, approximately 3 miles upriver from where Susan's body had been found. Susan's body was taken to the State Division of Forensic Science to determine her cause and manner of death. Investigators stated early on that they did not believe Susan's death had been a suicide, although they could not comment further about what had caused her death without the full results from her post-mortem examination. Susan's loved ones initially believed her death had been an accident, largely because evening before Susan's body was found, he had gone to the movies with a friend. Susan was sitting on their porch, drinking wine and sending texts when he and his friend arrived home. The friend remained at the house for a brief time before going home. Susan called and texted friends and family members for the next several hours. She was having a conversation with her sister, Missy, over text until 12:30 a.m. on July 23rd. According to Missy, there was nothing unusual about their conversation. Susan continued calling and texting friends until 2:45 a.m. The friends she was texting during this time were all ones she had made while living in California. So while it was almost 3 a.m. on the East Coast, it was only approaching midnight for her friends on the West Coast. Susan being up so late and sending so many texts was perfectly normal behavior for her during the summer months. During the school year, she was dedicated to her students and kept a schedule that allowed her to get enough sleep to be ready for the early mornings she had for school. When school was not in session, however, Susan would regularly stay up late to focus more on spending time with her friends and family or communicating with them. What was unusual about Susan's behavior that night is the fact that she then left home. Her reason for leaving remains unknown. There is no record of her contacting someone and agreeing to meet with them. And while Susan occasionally smoked cigarettes in the evenings, her family does not believe that she would have left home at 3 in the morning to purchase them. Even if she had, she traveled in the opposite direction of the nearest place where she could buy them at that time of night. Authorities were able to use Susan's cell phone records as well as surveillance footage to determine that her vehicle had pulled out of her driveway at 3:02 a.m. 2 minutes later, it was parked on Walker's Mill Road, where it would be located later that morning after Susan's body was found. Since Susan's home was only about a mile away, it appears that the car was driven straight from the home to Walker's Mill Road. Because of the darkness of the surveillance footage and the distance of the cameras from the car, no one can be seen getting out of the car. No one can be seen getting out of the car after it was parked, and it cannot be determined if Susan was the person driving the car or if anyone else was in the car with her. One detail been as he was going up to bed. He and Susan both took sleep aids they had been prescribed. For Susan, that sleep aid was Ambien. In May of 2019, the Food and Drug Administration issued a warning about Ambien and several similar drugs after patients taking them began experiencing dangerous side effects. While these side effects are very rare, they have resulted in injury and death. The FDA found 66 cases in which patients who took this category of drug unknowingly engaged in dangerous activities like sleepwalking or driving while not fully awake. 46 of these incidents involved serious but non-fatal injuries like burns and the loss of limbs. 20 of them resulted in the patient's death caused by accidental drowning, falls, hypothermia, and carbon monoxide poisoning. No matter how unusual these severe side effects are, if Susan had taken Ambien, it opened up the possibility that she had been experiencing some of them leading up to her death. If she had not been fully awake, it could explain why she left her house for no identifiable reason, and she could have accidentally gone into the water after she parked her car. However, problems with this theory were identified quickly after Susan's death. The terrain between where Susan parked her car and the river would have made it very difficult for Susan to make it directly down to the water, especially at night, and while she was theoretically impaired. Additionally, despite the proximity of Susan's car to the river, authorities quickly came to the realization that Susan most likely did not go into the river near where the vehicle was parked. That stretch of the river had exposed rocks due to low water levels and other obstructions that would have prevented her body from continuing down the river to where it was ultimately discovered. Susan most likely went into the water closer to where her body was ultimately located. Furthermore, Susan's death did not occur immediately after she left her home. Susan wore a Fitbit, which recorded activity in a heartbeat until around 7 a.m., 4 hours after Susan left home and half an hour before her body was discovered. Unfortunately, this model did not have a GPS system, meaning it could not be used to track Susan's movements. Susan's cell phone had been found inside her purse, which had been left inside of her car, and therefore it also could not be used to determine where Susan went during this period of time when her location and activities remain unaccounted for. The theory that Susan had experienced an adverse reaction to Ambien was fully discredited when her toxicology report was finalized. The report showed that she did have some alcohol in her system at the time of her death, but no Ambien or any illegal drugs. The theory that Susan's death was the result of an accident was also disproven a few months after she passed away. In early October, authorities informed Susan's family that the Delaware Division of Forensic Science had ruled that Susan's death had been a homicide. They found that the cause of her death had been blunt force trauma and drowning. Due to their ongoing investigation, the Delaware State Police have not disclosed the exact nature of Susan's injuries or where they were located on her body. These findings were made public on November 14, 2019. As confusing as the 4-hour gap between the time Susan left her house and the time she was killed is, it does offer a wider window of opportunity for witnesses to have seen her. Since Susan's death, her family has organized efforts that have distributed thousands of flyers in the area where her body was found, hoping that witnesses with information that could potentially identify Susan's killer will come forward. While the exact location where Susan entered the river has not been identified, the general area along the river has parks and condo buildings where early morning dog walkers and joggers may have seen Susan or something suspicious on the morning of July 23, 2019. Susan was 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighed 130 pounds, and was wearing a purple tank top at the time she was killed. Susan's family has partnered with $50,000 reward for information that leads to an arrest in the case. The Morrisy family is also preserving Susan's memory and her teaching legacy through the establishment of the Susan Morrisy Foundation. A major focus of the foundation is the Susan Morrisy Ledgard Prize for Achievement in English, a partial scholarship awarded to students from the high school where Susan was teaching at the time of her death who excel in the subject of English. The foundation awarded its first scholarship to one of Susan's former students in 2021. 2 additional students from Academy Park High School received scholarships in 2022. While Susan's family has found some comfort in honoring her legacy through the foundation, they struggle greatly with her death and the lack of answers in her case. Losing Susan and not knowing who is responsible for her murder has dramatically changed their lives individually, as well as their dynamic as a family. The Morrisy family has asked that anyone with information, no matter how insignificant it may seem, report it to police so that they can evaluate its importance. Even the smallest detail could potentially lead to the identification of Susan's killer. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.